Okay, dear colleagues, dear partners, dear students, thank you. Thank you, Maria. Thank you to the METIS Consortium and especially the other people of the team here in Luxembourg for the invitation to contribute to this lecture series. It's really a privilege to speak to a community that has chosen to ask very seriously what medical education should look like in the age of ICT and artificial intelligence. I should say at the outset what I am and what I am not. I'm actually not a medical educator. I do not train physicians. I train primary school teachers. I come to this question from the field of educational technology, from cognitive science, and from the learning sciences. And I come as a colleague from the same university in Luxembourg. And I'm interested in what these disciplines have to offer to the conversation you have been having. So I will not be telling you how to teach medicine. I will be offering a way to think about what learning and teaching have become with ICT and AI, especially reshaping the conditions under which these two activities happen. And I will invite you to take what is useful and leave what is not. I want to begin with a sentence from the French philosopher Michel Serres. Serres, who died in 2019, spent the last decade of his life trying to make sense of what he called the great mutation, the deep transformation we see in our societies under the influence of digital media. It can be summarized in a phrase I want you to keep in mind for the next 45 minutes. When media change, everything changes. Everything, not only how we communicate, not only how we entertain ourselves, everything. What it means to know something, what it means to be educated, what counts as authority, what counts as an expert, what we expect a teacher to do, what we expect a student to do, what we expect a medical doctor to do. This is the claim I want to defend today. I want to defend it specifically for medical education because I think medicine is a domain where the stakes of getting education wrong are perhaps highest. Medical education is not preparing people for low consequence work. It is preparing people who, in a few years, will sit across from a patient, possibly one of us in this room, possibly one of our parents, and decide what to do. And so the question I want to put on the table this afternoon is uncomfortably simple. If a medical student today can ask a large language model, an AI, to explain the differential diagnosis of diabetes, generate a structured clinical note, propose a diagnostic plan, and quote the relevant guideline, and get a coherent, mostly correct answer in 11 seconds, what exactly are we still teaching and how? I'm not going to pretend that the answer is obvious. I'm going to argue instead that the honest answer requires us to do something that universities have been remarkably reluctant to do, not only in Europe, not only in medical education, but across the board. Rethink how, from the ground up, our relationship to knowledge, to authority, and to the very idea of an educated person. Putting old wine in new bottles will not save us. The bottles have actually changed the wine. Let me start with where the METIS project itself starts, also with this number. Fewer than 20% of European medical curricula currently integrate training in emerging digital technologies. That figure comes from work synthesized by the European Commission and reflected in the recent OECD reports on the digital readiness of health professions. So 80% of European medical curricula, in other words, are training the doctors of 2035 with the curricular logic of 1995. This is not a small problem, and it is not solved by adding just a module in the curriculum. The gap is structural. It exists because medical education, like most of higher education, by the way, has historically been organized around a particular implicit theory that a curriculum is a delivery system for a stable body of knowledge, that a teacher is an authoritative source of that knowledge, and that a student becomes competent by absorbing it, demonstrating absorption in an exam, and then maybe applying it in practice. Each link in that chain is now under stress. Widely cited estimates suggest that medical knowledge now doubles in a matter of months rather than years. Denson in 2011 has put the doubling time at around 73 days, a figure that was already alarming a decade ago and that has only been accelerated under conditions of open access publishing, preprint culture, and now the AI-assisted literature synthesis we can all do. The exact number can be argued about, the direction cannot. The oncologist who graduates this year will, by the time they are mid-career, be practicing in a domain where the majority of relevant clinical knowledge did not exist when they were a student. This is not a marginal observation, I think. It dissolves the foundational assumption of front-loaded training. Our students arrive in the lecture hall with a device in their pocket that can answer most factual questions faster, more comprehensively, and often more clearly than we can as teachers. This is not a complaint, it's a description. Search engines, medical reference databases, and now general-purpose large language models, these tools have collectively dethroned the lecture as a knowledge transition technology. A 2023 scoping review found that medical students already use generative AI for clinical reasoning practice, case generation, and exam preparation in ways their faculty are largely unaware of. They use it to generate practice cases the curriculum does not even provide. They use it to explain concepts the lecturer did not make clear. They use it to draft summaries of papers they have not read, to rehearse oral examinations, to translate medical content across languages, to compress textbook chapters into study cards overnight. Some of these practices are extending student cognitions, others are quietly substituting for it. And faculty in many institutions do not yet have a clear picture of which is which. The information asymmetry between teacher and student that justified direct instruction has flattened, and in some areas it has inverted. If assessments measure recall and recognition of stable factual content, and if a smartphone can pass these assessments better than a human, what exactly is being credentialized? The pandemic forced higher education to confront this already. Across many institutions, carefully constructed multiple choice exams collapsed epistemologically. The moment students could consult any source, the reflex back then was to police that. Proctoring software, lockdown browsers, witch hunts for AI use. But the deeper question, which was mostly avoided, was whether the assessment was measuring anything that we deemed worth measuring in the first place. Universities have not yet rethought what they expect their graduates to demonstrate, and the gap between credential and competence is widening accordingly. So there is a curriculum logic predicated on stable knowledge, authoritative teachers, and recall-based assessment, and all three pillars are simultaneously now eroding. The Metis framing is therefore exactly right. This is not a problem solved by tacking on a module called AI in healthcare. It's a problem solved only by asking what medical education is for. To answer that question well, we need a clearer picture of what these technologies actually do. There is a temptation in higher education leadership circles to treat ICT and AI as efficiency tools, as a way to do the same things faster, cheaper, at scale. I want to argue today that this is a category error. It is the same error humans have made when, in the early years of the printing press, they assumed it was a faster scribe. There is, for this purpose, a useful framework here developed by the educational technology researcher Ruben Puentedura from the United States of America that he called the SAMR or SAMR model, an acronym for substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. Some of you will know it. For those who don't, it's a simple but illuminating way of describing 4 levels at which a technology can integrate into teaching. At the bottom, or here on the left, we have substitution. We swap the chalkboard for a PowerPoint, the textbook for a PDF, a handwritten essay for a Word document. The activity is identical, only the medium changes. At the top, or here on the right, we have redefinition. We do something with the technology that was not previously possible at all, that we could not even conceive without new technology. The two middle levels, augmentation and modification, can be seen as intermediate stations on the way up that ladder. The honest assessment is that most ICT integration in higher education, including in medical schools, has lived at the bottom of that ladder. We have substituted media. We have not redefined practice. The lecture became a recorded lecture, became a video conference lecture, like here. Then it became an archived video with an automatic transcription. All this is really nice and fine, but the activity, one expert speaking to many novices, remained essentially unchanged from the medieval university times. AI now makes that simple substitution untenable, because what AI substitutes is not a medium, it substitutes the cognitive activity itself. When a student asks a large language model to summarize a paper, the model does not just deliver the paper faster, it performs the act of reading and summarizing on the student's behalf. The cognitive labor that the assignment was designed to elicit, the labor that was the point, has been outsourced here. This is what makes the current moment categorically different from previous waves of ICT integration. The calculator might have outsourced arithmetic. The search engine has outsourced retrieval. AI outsources something different: synthesis, explanation, drafting, even argumentation. These are not peripheral cognitive operations. In most curricula, they are the thing we are trying to teach and should be teaching. Faced with this, the academic world has split into two camps, and I think both are mistaken. The first camp is restrictive. Ban the tools, police the work, reinstate the in-class handwritten exam, return to the oral tradition. This camp is intellectually nostalgic and practically doomed. The students will use the tools anyway in the world they will work in, and we will have prepared them mostly for a credentialing ritual rather than something meaningful for their professional life. The second camp is celebratory, difficult word. So it's about embracing the tools, teaching prompt engineering, letting students co-write everything with AI. This camp mistakes a traditional skill like prompting for a durable competence, and it confuses access to capability with development of that capability. A student who has only ever produced AI-assisted writing has not necessarily learned to write any more than a passenger has learned to drive. The position I want to defend here is neither of these. It is that ICT, and especially AI, fundamentally reconfigures the educational equation. And we need to ask three questions about every learning activity. What cognitive operation is the activity supposed to develop in the learner? Can the technology perform that operation? If yes, does the activity still develop the learner, or does it merely produce an artifact? If the technology can perform the operation, what new educational task replaces the old one? What is now the learner's distinctive cognitive contribution? These questions force us back to fundamentals. They force us to ask what we actually believe about knowledge and learning. So let me turn to that next. I want to spend a few minutes on three words we use constantly and rarely examine: knowledge, learning, and teaching. Each of them carries a folk theory. Each folk theory is wrong in ways that matter here. The dominant metaphor in everyday talk about education is that knowledge is stuff. We transmit it. Students absorb it. Their heads are full of it. Some students have more than others. The metaphor is so pervasive that we use it without noticing, and it is, from the perspective of contemporary cognitive science, almost entirely misleading. Knowledge, as constructivist learning theory has insisted since at least Piaget and as the situated cognition tradition further specified, is not stuff. It is a relation. It is a structured, embodied, often tacit capacity to act competently in a domain. To know how to read a chest X-ray is not to have stored an X-ray atlas in your head. It is to have developed perceptual schemata that let you see things on a film that an untrained person literally cannot see. To know how to take a clinical history is not to have memorized a checklist. It is to have developed an embodied, attentive way of being with another person under specific epistemic constraints. This matters enormously for AI because AI is extraordinarily good at the substance metaphor of knowledge. It stores, retrieves, summarizes, and reformulates propositional content. It is much weaker at the relational, embodied, contextual sense of knowledge. A large language model can tell you what cyanosis is. I can hardly pronounce it. It can, however, not recognize it in the color of a patient's skill. That distinction is not a technical limitation we are about to overcome easily. It's a conceptual one, and it tells us where the educational work has to go today. If knowledge is not a substance, then learning is not absorption. The socio-constructivist tradition running from Vygotsky through Piaget and Brunner and into contemporary learning sciences argues that learning is meaning-making. Learners construct understanding by integrating new experiences with existing cognitive schemata through processes of assimilation and accommodation, mediated by language, by external tools, by other people, and by our surrounding culture. The socio-prefix matters here. Meaning is not constructed in solitary hands, but through participation in social practices, communities, and conversations. Learning is not what happens when information enters the mind. It is what happens when the mind reorganizes itself around an experience, usually in dialogue with others. The implication, the bottleneck of learning is not access to information. It has not been for at least 30 years now, and certainly not since broadband internet. The bottleneck of learning is the cognitive work of integration, the effortful, often uncomfortable process of connecting new ideas to existing ones, of reconciling contradictions, of restructuring one's mental models. This work cannot be outsourced. If it is outsourced, learning has not occurred. Only an artifact has been produced. This is, I think, the single most important fact about AI in education, and the one we keep failing to confront. The chatbot can produce the artifact. It cannot do the integration. The integration has to happen in the learner. And this brings us to teaching. If learning is meaning-making, then teaching cannot primarily be a matter of delivering content. The delivery model, sage on the stage, transmission, lecture, exam, was always a poor fit for how human cognition actually works. It is now a catastrophically poor fit because the delivery function has been almost entirely automated. The contemporary learning sciences offer a better metaphor. Teaching as the design of learning environments. The teacher's central craft is not to be the source of information. It is to design the conditions under which learners do the integrative cognitive work that produces understanding. These conditions include problems worth thinking about, materials worth engaging with, peers worth talking to, feedback worth attending to, and the kind of supportive friction that makes thinking necessary. Notice what this implies. A teacher who lectures well at the speed of speech is, in the era of AI, doing something a recorded video and a chatbot can do equivalently or better. Feels a bit weird for me to do that now. A teacher who designs a clinical reasoning exercise, on the other hand, that puts a small group of students in productive disagreement about an ambiguous case and who knows when to intervene and when to step back, that teacher is doing something irreplaceable. The shift the Metis project gestures towards, the shift universities need to make, is exactly this shift from delivery to design. Let me get concrete now, because this is a medical education audience and you are entitled to ask what any of this looks like in a curriculum on Tuesday morning. Medical professional competence has for decades been described not as a collection of facts, but as a set of integrative capacities. The classics: can meds, framework identifies 6 roles a medical expert has to play: communicator, collaborator, leader, health advocate, scholar, professional. They go well beyond having content knowledge. The other 6, well, they are about judgment, relationship, communication, ethics, and self-direction. These are precisely the capacities that AI does not replace, and they are precisely the capacities that lectures and multiple choice exams have always struggled to develop and assess nicely. So the redesign that you are aiming for is not a radical innovation. This is a long overdue alignment of medical education with what the field already says it has been trying to produce. So let me propose 4 principles for designing such learning environments in medical education in the AI era. They are not exhaustive, they are just a starting point. First, make the cognitive work visible and unavoidable. If AI can produce the artifact, the essay, the case write-up, the differential diagnosis, then assessment of the artifact alone is meaningless. The redesign is to assess the thinking. This means, oral examination, viva voce, structured case discussions, think aloud protocols, and process portfolios in which students document their reasoning, their dead ends, their revisions, and their interactions with AI tools. A growing number of medical schools across Europe, North America, and Australia are actually now experimenting with that, what we might call AI transparent assessment, in which students are required to use AI tools and to critically annotate the output. The point is not to detect AI, it is to make the human cognitive contribution observable. Second, center the curriculum on problems, not topics. Problem-based learning is not new. McMaster pioneered it in the 1960s, but its rationale is sharper than ever, I think. When students start from a problem rather than a topic, they have to integrate across the boundaries that disciplinary lectures impose. They have to identify what they do not know, and they have to develop the metacognitive skill of directing their own learning. AI is, in this design, a powerful research and explanation tool. But the cognitive frame, the question structure, the integrative judgment must come from the learner. The literature on problem-based learning shows comparable or superior knowledge retention to traditional curricula and substantial advantages in clinical reason and self-directed learning. Third, build in productive struggle and timely feedback. Cognitive science is unambiguous about one thing. Learning that produces durable understanding involves what Björk and Björk have called desirable difficulties. Spaced retrieval, interleaved practice, generative effort before correction. These principles are widely supported by experimental and educational research. They are also chronically violated by the lecture and cram model that we have been using in the past. AI changes the equation here too, not by replacing struggle, but by enabling vastly more frequent, individualized, low-stakes practice. A well-designed AI tutor, for instance, can generate unlimited variant cases, give immediate diagnostic feedback, and adapt difficulty. The human teacher's role is to ensure that the practice is well designed, that the feedback is well interpreted, and that the student is not learning shortcuts. Fourth, treat clinical reasoning as a thinking practice, not a knowledge base. The diagnostic era literature, going back to Cross-Carey's foundational work, has shown that physician error is rarely due to a lack of knowledge. It is due to failures of reasoning under uncertainty, premature closure, anchoring, availability bias, failure to consider base rates. These are not knowledge deficits, they are thinking deficits. They have to be taught explicitly, practiced deliberately, and reflected on systematically. This is, in a sense, the deepest implication of AI for medical education, but also for other fields of higher education. We are entering an era in which AI will routinely generate the differential, propose the workup, and flag the guideline. The physician's distinctive cognitive contribution will be increasingly the meta-level work, judging when the AI is wrong, when the case does not fit the pattern when the social and ethical context demands deviation from the algorithmic recommendation. That is a thinking skill, and it has to be centerpiece in the curriculum. There is a useful distinction in the philosophy of mind articulated by Andy Clark and David Chalmers in their famous Extended Mind paper between tools that extend cognition and tools that replaces. A notebook extends memory, a calculator extends arithmetic. These are partners in cognition. The human remains the agent. A tool that does the thinking for you is a different beast. It de-skills, it de-responsibilizes, and over time it atrophies the very capacity it was meant to support. The pedagogical task is to design AI use in medical education such that the technology functions as a cognitive partner, not as a cognitive substitute. This is the design problem, not a policy problem, I think. It cannot be solved by a directive that says students may use AI for X but not for Y. It can only be solved by learning environments that require the student to be the cognitive agent, that make the human contribution visible and accessible, and that build deliberately the capacity to think with and sometimes against the machine. Two competencies here deserve a particular mention because they sit at the heart of medical practice, as far as I understand it from an outsider's perspective, and because the four principles I have just sketched before do not address them directly: ethical judgment and collaboration. Both are precisely the kind of capacity AI cannot substitute, and both are chronically underweighted in curricula organized around content coverage. Ethical judgment is not the application of a rule book. It is the situated capacity to recognize that a situation has an ethical dimension, to hold competing values in tension, and to act with integrity when the right course is genuinely unclear. A large language model can recite the four principles of biomedical ethics. It cannot feel the moral weight of telling a family that further treatment is, in this case, futile. That weight is part of what we are training. Collaboration, similarly, is not a soft skill bolted onto technical training. It is the cognitive practice of distributing reasoning across a team, handing over a patient at shift change, working with a nurse who has seen something the doctor missed, disagreeing productively with a colleague about a diagnosis. Both ethics and collaboration are learned the way clinical reasoning is learned, through deliberately designed practice in conditions of real or simulated uncertainty with attentive feedback. They cannot be learned from lectures, and they cannot be learned from a chatbot. That argument that the central educational task is the cultivation of integrative thinking leaves the question hanging. What does an integrative framework actually look like in a medical curriculum? It is one thing to say that students should learn to weave facts together. It is another thing to point at the body of knowledge and say, this is what an integrative framework looks like. This is what it does for a learner, and this is why a medical curriculum that does not have one ends up as a pile of facts rather than a science. So I want to spend a few minutes on such a framework because I think it is among the most underused in medical education, and because it illustrates precisely the kind of meaning-making knowledge I have been advocating for. The framework is evolutionary biology. The figure is Charles Darwin. I am stepping outside my own discipline to point at it, but I do so because what evolutionary thinking does for biological facts is structurally the same thing that any good integrative framework does for any body of knowledge. It turns a heap of facts into a pattern. And that, I want to argue, is what AI cannot do easily and what an educated mind must. I should add that this is not for me a purely abstract preference. In my own field of training, cognitive psychology, Darwin's theory has played exactly this integrative role. Without an evolutionary frame, the human mind is a strange collection of cognitive quirks. Why are we so bad at probability and so good at faces? Why do we crave social approval to a degree that overrides our health? Why does fear hijack reasoning under stress? With an evolutionary frame, these stop being curiosities and start being a coherent a picture of a mind shaped by selection environments quite different from the ones we now live in. So I personally cherish this framework, not only because I think it is intellectually powerful, but because I have lived in my own learning what it does to a heap of facts when an integrated framework arises. I think medical students deserve that experience too. There is a famous essay by the geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky, written in 1973, the year I was born, with the descriptively simple title, Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution. His point was not that biologists need to memorize some chapter on evolution before they can do their work. His point was that without an evolutionary frame, biological facts remain, disconnected curiosities. With it, they form a coherent science. Evolution is the integrative framework that makes the facts make sense. I want to argue that evolutionary medicine, sometimes called Darwinian medicine, plays exactly this role for clinical knowledge. Without an evolutionary frame, the human body is a sequence of mysteries. Why is the appendix there? Why do we get morning sickness? Why does the immune system sometimes attack the body's own tissues? Why do some bacteria become resistant to our antibiotics within a single human lifetime? Why is type 2 diabetes a global pandemic now and not in 1900? Why do we crave sugar and fat in quantities that might eventually kill us? Each of these questions has a coherent evolutionary answer. The body is not designed, it is the product of selection acting on variation in environments very different from the ones we now inhabit. Many of our current pathologies are mismatches between adaptations shaped over hundreds of thousands of years for one ecological niche and the radically novel environment of caloric abundance, sedentary work, antibiotic ubiquity, and chronic psychosocial stress that characterizes modern life. This evolutionary frame does at least three things in a medical curriculum. It transforms a heap of facts into a coherent science. The student does not memorize that some bacteria resist antibiotics. They understand why selection makes resistance inevitable, wherever antibiotics are used, which is a vastly more useful and more durable understanding. It builds population-level thinking, which is essential for public health, epidemiology, and the responsible use of medicines and vaccines, and which is increasingly relevant for AI-assisted population health management. It provides a framework for thinking about uncertainty and about the limits of intervention. Evolutionary biology teaches humility. Bodies are injury-rigged, trade-offs are everywhere, and an intervention that solves one problem often creates another. But there is a deeper reason Darwin matters here, and it is not really about evolution per se. It is about what kind of thinker Charles Darwin was and what kind of thinking the practice of medicine in the AI era will demand. Darwin's great intellectual achievement was to weave together facts from extraordinary disparate domains into a single explanatory framework. He was not necessarily the deepest specialist in any one of these fields. He was something rarer, and I would argue more important. He was a synthesizer. He had what Edgar Morin, in his book on educational reform, called tête bien faite, a well-made or well-formed head, rather than a tête bien pleine, a well-filled one. The well-filled head accumulates facts. The well-made or well-formed head integrates them, sees patterns across them, and generates new questions from the pattern. This is the kind of mind that medical education needs to produce in the AI era. The well-filled head is the head that AI replicates and outperforms, I would frankly say. The well-made head is what AI cannot and likely will not replicate. But yeah, the future is open. The capacity to weave, to synthesize, to perceive that something does not fit, to ask the question that no one has asked yet in the history of humanity. This is the distinctive human contribution to clinical practice and to medical science, I would argue. And this, I want to suggest, is not just a nice to have. It is the central educational objective. We have for too long organized medical curricula around content coverage. We need to organize them around the development of integrative thinking. Darwin here is one model. There are certainly others, but the principle is the same. I want to close by returning to the phrase I just borrowed a moment ago, because it is the phrase I would like to leave you with. It is an old phrase, attributed in its modern form to Montaigne in the 16th century. Il vaut mieux une tête bien faite qu'une tête bien pleine. Better a well-made head than a well-filled one. Edgar Morin took it as the title of a book at the end of the 20th century, in which he argued against the increasing fragmentation of academic disciplines, that education must above all develop the capacity to connect, to contextualize, to think across. The phrase has, I think, never been more relevant than it is today. The well-filled head is the head AI fills better than we ever could. There is no point competing on that ground. The well-made head, a head that connects, contextualizes, judges, doubts, synthesizes, is what we have to develop, because it is what the world will need in medicine and in other domains. And to make a well-made head, we need an education that goes beyond training. Training fits a person to a known job in a known environment. Education prepares a person to find their footing in environments we cannot even fully predict today. Training answers to the question how. Education sustains the questions why and what for, and in light of what. Training has a clear endpoint. Education is a disposition of curiosity, of willingness to learn for the rest of one's life, of desire to know, even when it is not yet clear what one will do with the knowing. This is what the METIS project at its best is reaching for. Not a module on AI, not a workshop on prompt engineering, not a credential in digital health, but a curricular logic adequate to a world in which medical students will need to keep learning, keep adapting, keep questioning for the next 40 years of their professional lives in a healthcare environment we cannot today describe. The shift in the phrase is from teaching students what to know towards designing the conditions in which they will learn how to think, how to interpret, how to decide, and how to act under uncertainty. That is the shift the abstract of this talk promised. That is the shift I have tried to argue for, and that is the shift I would now like to leave with you as a set of questions. Here are the questions that I would like to put to any curriculum review committee in any medical school anywhere in Europe this year. First, are they educating or are they training? Are they filling heads or are they forming them? Second, when AI can do the cognitive work an assignment was designed to elicit, what is the new cognitive work being asked of the students? And is it visible, accessible, and worth doing? Third, are students being taught to think with the machine or merely to use it? Because the future of medicine, of healthcare, and frankly of human cognitive life depends on the difference. Michel Serres said, when media change, everything changes. The media have changed. Our task is now to make sure that what changes with them is finally our courage to rethink what an educated medical doctor is for. I hope these reflections have given you something useful to think with and the courage perhaps to do the work that has to follow. And with that, I thank you for listening and I'm looking forward to your questions.